Discover how Mongolian nomads engineered portable homes that outperform modern insulation in -40-degree blizzards. A 2,000-year-old solution still unmatched.
Chapter 1. White Tyranny.
The vast, merciless Mongolian steppe appears as an absolute, overwhelming void, where the horizon dissolves into an infinite whiteness, and time and space seem entirely frozen under the weight of a brutal, apocalyptic winter. The story begins in the dark heart of this inhospitable landscape, at the very center of a relentless climatic cataclysm known for centuries by the local indigenous nomads as the Dzud. This phenomenon is not merely a change of seasons, it is a manifestation of nature's fury on an epic, destructive scale, where extreme, paralyzing frosts and endless, dense blizzards create an environment absolutely hostile to any biological life. The camera, behaving like an objective, impassive, cold observer, drifts majestically above the frozen earth, capturing in its lens staggering, almost documentary-style frames that convey with extraordinary surgical precision the all-powerful might of nature. The wide-angle lenses employed by the cinematographer maximally amplify the sense of vastness, revealing the steppe as a boundless frozen ocean of heaving snow and ice, over which a leaden, heavy, ominously threatening sky dominates with complete mercilessness. The narrator, using the cool detachment beneath which lies a palpable, almost reverent awe, outlines the tragic stakes of this unequal battle. Ambient temperatures plummet precipitously to the terrifying level of -40 degrees Celsius, and the wind, howling damnably like a wounded mythical beast, carries with it enormous, murderous quantities of crystallized ice capable of literally stripping flesh from exposed bone in a matter of minutes. The snow, incredibly dense, opaque, heavy, and aggressively structured, completely and irrevocably erases the line of the horizon, entirely obliterating any natural boundary between the frozen earth and the raging sky, plunging the disoriented viewer into a state of absolute, primal terror. The visual style operates with an extremely high dynamic range, where the brutal, cruel beauty of the Mongolian winter steppe manifests in its full power through drastic, eye-searing contrasts between the blinding, clinical whiteness of the omnipresent snow cover and the deep, dark, light-absorbing shadows cast by the few wind-lashed irregularities of the frozen terrain. This frozen opening definitively establishes an emotional chain of dread before the majesty of nature's destroying force.
At the very epicenter of this endless frozen desert, the camera's precise attention focuses on a microscopic, seemingly completely irrelevant and trivial detail that within a fraction of a second becomes a powerful, universal symbol of the ultimate, unconditional capitulation of humanity before the uncompromising forces of nature. It is an incredibly close macroscopic shot of the display of a modern digital thermometer, merely an integral component of advanced, enormously expensive measuring equipment that was, in the optimistic designs of its engineers, intended to serve in the precise monitoring of local atmospheric conditions during a scientific expedition. The terrified viewer watches in trembling real time as, on the liquid crystal, dimly backlit screen, the numerals change at a terrifying, almost unnatural velocity, mercilessly documenting the drastic, fatal plunge of the ambient temperature in the environment surrounding the station. An ominous -30, then a blood-chilling -35, until finally the merciless electronic mechanism halts at the ultimate, sinister, absolute value, -40 degrees Celsius. At precisely this critical fractional moment, a complete, irreversible physical collapse of modern, loudly advertised technology occurs. A slow optical zoom reveals with hypnotic precision how, on the smooth protective glass of the digital display, with extraordinary, almost malicious speed, sharp ice crystals of frost begin rapidly forming, resembling in their shape complex, geometric, infinitely intricate fractal patterns of dead winter ferns. This destructive crystal structure of ice races swiftly across the hard edges of the electronic device, slowly, patiently, but absolutely inexorably consuming the last fading source of digital artificial light in this impenetrable dark landscape. The lithium battery powering the instrument, wholly unprepared by its self-absorbed Western creators for functioning in such extreme, merciless thermal conditions, in a fraction of a minute violently loses its nominal design capacity, and the sensitive liquid crystals imprisoned within the thin, crack-susceptible screen undergo the brutal process of instantaneous freezing, causing the slow, agonizing, and final extinction of the displayed numerical data forever. Near this dead, forever silenced, and completely useless thermometer, in the continuously thickening, dark blizzard hammering ice crystals into the earth, a gigantic geometric metal mass looms in the distance, which merely several hours ago was an undeniable, supremely proud symbol of human domination, technological supremacy, and supposed mastery over absolutely every terrain on planet Earth, no matter how hostile. It is the most advanced, powerful expedition research vehicle with innovative all-axle drive, designed from the ground up for tens of millions of dollars, with the sole intention of quickly and effortlessly conquering the most difficult, most treacherous polar and Siberian routes. Now, however, it has been irrevocably reduced by the fury of the Mongolian Zud to the role of a pathetic, humiliating steel monument to infinite technological arrogance and the engineering hubris of Western science. The camera performs an extraordinarily slow, circular, tension-laden approach toward this completely ruined, trapped, powerful machine, mercilessly showing viewers the absolute, almost unimaginable degree of its rapid structural degradation caused by sub-zero temperatures. The gigantic, very wide tires with their extremely deep, aggressive off-road tread, cast in sterile factories from specialized, highly elastic, expensive rubber compounds, hardened under the destructive influence of prolonged extreme cold to such a degree that they now resemble solid, unyielding, brittle stone, and their originally smooth, gleaming black structure begins before the shocked viewer's eyes to rapidly cover itself with a dense network of microfractures heralding inevitable, ultimate, catastrophic fragmentation. The armored, multi-layered, theoretically bulletproof windows of this proud all-terrain vehicle are already completely covered by an unimaginably thick, very hard, completely opaque layer of ice sculpted by the merciless hurricane wind, rendering the once cozy, very warm interior of the advanced climate-controlled cabin nothing but a dark, icy, absolutely inaccessible and terrifying tomb of wrought iron, brittle glass, and cold cracked plastic. The next element in this shattering, snowy diorama of the complete defeat of human intellect in battle against the elements is a very modern, super-light, advanced geodesic dome tent, rigorously designed in laboratories with the sole purpose of conquering the most difficult, extreme expeditions on the peaks of the Himalayas and long freezing scientific research in Antarctica. Its seemingly innovative and groundbreaking structure rested solidly on an extremely complex, mathematically precise geometric lattice of interconnected, highly durable, flexible carbon fiber rods and multi-layer, ultra-light yet supposedly phenomenally tear-resistant composite material coated in multiple polyurethane layers,
which in the optimistic theoretical assumptions of Western designers was to constitute the ultimate, impenetrable, absolutely indomitable barrier against all the worst known and unknown terrestrial ice storms. The camera, moved with extraordinary steadiness by an invisible operator, in dramatic, painful, extremely slow and emotionally charged virtual approaches, slowly and methodically analyzes from the ground up the entire exposed anatomy of this artificial, enormously complex geodesic construction, focusing at very large magnification on the extremely fine structural details and engineering connections that in recently published glossy promotional brochures were to unconditionally and emphatically guarantee every buyer 100% undisturbed safety, but which now, in direct confrontation with the murderous attack of a Siberian frozen pressure front, fail on the entire infinite line of the combat front in a manner that is utterly spectacular, pitiable, and definitively unmasking the false self-confidence of the human species. The garish, almost aggressively eye-catching technical material of the 10th shell, maintained rigorously in the bright orange of safety neon, was, by the designer's definition, to infallibly ensure absolutely perfect, very far-ranging and flawless rescue visibility from the aerial deck of searching rescue helicopters. Yet in direct, brutal physical confrontation with the all-encompassing cold and murderous Mongolian whiteness of the wasteland, it appears in this landscape as nothing more than a loud, sense-irritating, and extremely unnatural-colored intruder, with which the enraged and merciless wind decided from the very start of the storm to deal immediately and with extreme brutality.
The intricate, geometric Western geodesic construction of this magnificent modern shelter, which absolutely uncritically and proudly relied on the immutable, fundamental physical principle of constant rigidity, total absence of yielding elasticity, and extreme surface structural tension, naively and unreflectingly assumed a hard, frontal, graceless power struggle with the untamed, chaotic, raging winter element striking from the Siberian wastes. This very stance of engineering arrogance, which ignores the power of nature and brutally places human mathematics above atmospheric forces in the chaotic, deeply and brutally fluid environment of the freezing Mongolian steppe, reveals itself with terrifying speed and obviousness to be an absolutely fatal, unforgivable, and ultimately deadly cognitive error committed carelessly by so-called modern, table-absorbed civilization. This supremely critical, maximally terrifying and breathtaking moment of the sudden and final destruction of the allegedly indestructible armored geodesic tent is filmed in a manner that is hyper-realistically painful, almost uncannily resembling a certain slow cinematic sequence of a military, powerful dynamite explosion in the middle of a proving ground, with masterful and fully perfect use of modern and precise slow-motion cinematography, which mercilessly allows the viewer, paralyzed to the marrow of their bones, to fully and with horror perceive even the smallest, seemingly completely microscopic and irrelevant details of this dynamically progressing, chaotic, and absolutely devastating consumption of the artificial matter from which the wind-torn structure is built. The blind but extremely murderously aggressive wind, freely reaching in its unexpected gusts the terrifying and dizzying speed of a true oceanic hurricane, in this terrible frozen moment irrevocably ceases to be merely an ordinary, invisible, and innocent movement of cold air masses moving across the globe, and becomes a very hard, physical, fully palpable, hostile barrier, a powerful, concrete-like wall built solidly from condensed, rock-hard crystalline ice, lethal pressure, and alien hatred that violently strikes the shell with an incredible, destructive, impact kinetic force, giving absolutely no chance of mounting an equal defensive battle. In the fraction of a human eye's blink, after the long and exhausting struggle of artificial material against the absolute force of the Siberian cold's pressure, The fibers weakened by tension snap and violently tear apart with a loud, characteristic, utterly dry, fully deafening, and ear-splitting crack, one that strikingly resembles the brutal point-blank discharge of a heavy, long-range sniper rifle aimed with cold blood, all against the backdrop of the frozen horizon. This one extremely tiny, seemingly completely insignificant point on the great map of structural destruction triggers an immediate, very catastrophic, unstoppable, and ultimately physical chain reaction. Under enormous, merciless, destroying pressure, the accelerated air with furious impetus violently forces its way under the inner, defenseless, weakened skin of the material, then instantly and irreversibly transforms the very carefully designed, perfectly streamlined aerodynamic dome of the modern shell into one powerful, dangerously maximum resistance great parachute sail, forced to instantly absorb the entire, full, unchecked, murderous, and furious power of the frozen destroying element, which inevitably, within just a few dramatic seconds, loudly and definitively ends in the complete, epic tearing of the very strong shell and the utter, irreversible destruction of the only apparent shelter of mankind in this winter, infinite, treeless wilderness. After the vivid, very dramatic, methodical presentation of this extraordinarily spectacular fall of these very expensive human, naive engineering creations, Western artifacts of supposedly advanced technical thought in the wasteland, the visual narrative of the story smoothly yet darkly, majestically, and with awe focuses on the very heart of this murderous meteorological phenomenon, the ominous apocalyptic white Mongolian Zud, proceeding directly to unimaginably epic, monumental, very wide shots of the empty, boundless, biologically and thermally dead steppe, completely, brutally, and without warning, gripped by the soulless, loud fury of an endless, multi-day leaden snow blizzard in sub-zero temperatures, stripping away any last remnant of timid hope for a better tomorrow for the frozen inhabitants and lost researchers.
The omnipresent, inhuman, cold camera recording this grim document of death, skillfully using in its system the specific, fully advanced, digital, innovative Western visual optics and specialized digital software, along with physical sharp particle filters on the lenses, suddenly allows the speechless viewer, pressed deep into a safe cinema seat, to see in an almost magically hyper-realistic, very physical and almost immediate manner the angry, murderous, roaring stream of air, the dark and very invisible to the naked eye bare wind, which destroys and levels with the ground everything that humanity naively considers a fortress built in a sterile laboratory. The snow falling powerfully, mercilessly from the hostile firmament during the monstrous mind and body immobilizing Mongolian winter rage of the Zud bears absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to the delicate, very gentle, fluffy, soft, child-friendly, and even romantically Christmas white flakes so well known from memory to most viewers in the moderate and predictable climatic zones of peaceful, wealthy Europe or prosperous North America. These are in reality, from the standpoint of the microscopic precision of crystals and the merciless laws of unforgiving frost, hundreds of thousands, even tens of murderous millions of microscopic, hard, sharp, crystalline needles of frozen water, precisely and accurately as sharp as shattered quartz glass from a window, which aggressively, extremely brutally, and blindly, with great impact force, race ice through the empty void terrifyingly and uncompromisingly, absolutely parallel to the hard earth of the steppe, with a roaring, lethal speed unimaginable to urban physics, cutting through thick layers of massive, dense, stuffy winter air with the force and hardness of countless, merciless military miniature scalpels cast from dark shadow, ready to cut and open the smallest wounds. The merciless, methodical, and very wide, circular, solitary journey of the silent, sensitive lens of the modern precision camera in high digital resolution, slowly traversing this extremely dangerous, fully extreme and organic cell hostile environment of a world frozen in ice, brutally and nakedly proves the absolute, painful, physical blind solitude, the terrible all-encompassing emptiness and the very dark, emotional, truly unimaginably vast cosmic indifference of soulless and separated, powerful, cold, malicious nature to any evil or painful fates, bloody dramas or tragedies of all small forms of existence or creatures wandering unfortunately and unnecessarily in the wrong time and space.
Very, extremely, and epically very wide, impressively dimensional, cold, panoramic, stretched, cinematic shots of the screen, executed fearlessly from a high, distant, objective, vertical, aerial perspective, completely unachievable from below even the lonely great flight of a terrified bird in the storm, although they too are nonetheless due to the existing fog, undeniably strongly and powerfully and inconveniently very much organically limited from above to a small radius by the very strongly and actively wildly raging and vibrating, destroying all around and impenetrable wild predatory bloodthirsty winter-frozen aggressive element of white sky falling with the force of projectiles upon the Mother Earth sleeping under an icy heavy cruel sarcophagus, blind to pain. Ultimately, and with enormous dread, allow the great modern digital highly dynamic screen, despite numerous physical lighting difficulties, to nonetheless lift the eye from the ground, examine, and carefully from a safe angle, yet see, perceive that terrifying freezing in all cells, the entire flowing along vectors heated, weak, pale red, and pulsating with life, oxygen and glucose from the heart blood, in warm, thick, contracted, and squeezed human terrified veins. The painfully icy, deadly, horrible, immense boundlessness of this plane, and the quiet, terrible, staggering, empty, terrifying emptiness of this raw, merciless as a silently cutting sword, and forgotten, wild, hungry, and open Asian, dark through and through, blind and deaf, great territory, murderous trap rarely traversed in the heart of mysterious, legendary, ancient, solitary, enigmatic Central Asia amidst sands, and today amidst crystals cutting the faces of unprepared, naive wanderers, where the only lord of time remains the ceaselessly wild wind, carrying death to weaker forms. The steppe, deeply frozen with a crack in every smallest part under layers of permafrost and ice beneath this leaden, great mechanical, blind, dark, through and through, snowy, merciless and relentless storm without a breath, seems to be nothing but a completely, tragically dead land of annihilation, utterly slumbering in a white cemetery and without return to warmth, brutally deprived and stripped of absolutely any even microscopic, free, rare, warm pulse of blood or biological presence in this frame and place. Here there is no mercy. Here there is no trace of warmth. Here there is nothing, only the absolute, beautiful, terrible dominion of the Mongolian winter. The penetrating, crystalline light falling through the ice formations builds dread and cold. Cold in their reception, madly unfriendly to the depths, pained and hard as ice, half crystalline, translucent and piercingly crystal clear in the refraction, blue like deep glacier ice, primordial and sharp, dead, matte, very and extremely snowy, very aggressively destructive to living cells, terrifyingly white, ceaselessly bleached, blindly and austerely cold, by nature deadly, pained, dangerous, strong, impactful, dead in tonalities of cold, freezing, bluish, artificial light, inexorably from first to last, and aggressively and boldly and abundantly visually absolutely dominates with cold, in its dead palette on the total plane of the viewer's screen, continuously, systematically, with calculation and very methodically, second and centimeter by millimeter, inexorably slowly and deliberately, with great tension, freezing consciousness slowly, without respite, patiently very, monstrously coldly and with deliberate intent, systematically building from within and imposing, building with great expertise the cold, and slowly but inevitably rising to levels, great, multi-layered, inexorable, hard, overwhelming, extreme, extraordinary, immense, full of immobilizing, very paralyzing, dense, abnormally, and darkly poisonous like a shadow, atmosphere of great, complete, hopeless, incurably and permanently terrible, clinical, inhuman sterility of the dying, and lack of smell, beyond frost and very slow dying with each breath of frost, until in the finale to, in great suffering, objective and fully certain, unavoidable, definitively sealed with pain, inevitable cold, and final hard, cold, biological, absolute and undeniable quiet, in silence, and very irreversible, inescapable, powerful, objective, omnipresent, absolute, raw, terrible, physical, hard, final death of every pulsating species in the hard, cold as night ice, claws of whiteness, and in the embrace of poisonous and cooling frost, plunging a dagger into the cold-pained body of wanderers, orphaned by the great sun. At that same extremely crucial breakthrough moment in the visual narrative of this freezing documentary, the story of civilization's defeat at the hands of the steppe, the narrator's story behind the lens unexpectedly and drastically, strongly and expressively, almost brutally breaks from the devastation, instantly turns sharply aside and decides to enter irrevocably and completely from scratch on entirely new, imagination-based, deeper intellectual tracks hidden from the shadow of the mind, simultaneously, immediately, and aggressively to the detriment of the proud and ego-driven human, loudly compelling the human in a cold, shocked, and horrified body to reluctantly undertake a far darker, more down-to-earth, cold, very dark, quiet, deeper, cruel by nature, painful to understand, terrifying, great, ethically profound, deeply in nature sad and irreproducible, darkly cold, isolated, great, lonely on the steppe, philosophical reflection on the supposedly great, proudly proclaimed by evolution, pinnacle of the animal struggle for intelligence, namely the survival in the world as a solitary, lost, fragile, forgotten particle of futility as a being, supposedly weak in essence, small and fragile existence, objectively, allegedly marginal, by definition completely invisible, non-existent, a particle of cosmic dust in the great, terrifying, inhuman, empty, cold, sparless, silent, unimaginable, inhuman, powerful, black, infinite, empty, dead, blind, inhuman, black, silent, death, dark, vast, omnipotent on all axes of space, cosmic universe, cast utterly to the margins and without regret, hard, brutally cold, firmly and without mercy, indifferently thrown and quickly, brutally, very rejected, with indifferent, overt, very severe, penetrating, absolute, cold, soullessly deaf, silent, cold, unrevocable, great, enormous, and painful to the depths contempt of Mother Nature, as losses, quiet, cold, tragically dead, without chance, abandoned to the mercy of being frozen forever to bone, and utterly deaf, very broken, wreck-like remnants, blind, lost, very hard to the core, dead, silent, without trace, foreign machines, the so-called modern technology, stripped by the fury of the Dzud to nothing more than worthless debris. The very objectively distant and completely calculated, focused on cold, brutal, absolute physical, with great concentrated precision cold, inhuman, observational, without mercy, cold professional, hard investigatively, objectively cold, indifferently in shock, divested in the eye and completely devoid of any love or mercy, cold, calculated, professional, glassy, mechanical, undaunted in flight, slow, watchful to the point of pain, slowly very stable, powerful, watchful camera without emotion records the lens, ceaselessly, sharply, moving with attention, slowly, stably through icy shocks, moving sideways hard and very slowly, the lens moving slowly, indifferently rejecting emotions, moving hard in a funereal, rigid tempo, majestic, indifferent, unnaturally, raging slowly, from a distance, unhurried, powerfully slow, terrifying in slow motion, alienated, sad, devoid of anger, sad, alienated, cold, silent, unhurried, rigid, completely and absolutely unhurried, extraordinary, unhurried and in its lens extraordinary, quietly from afar, funereal, after death, motionless, powerful, alienated in the void, from above, great, funereal, monstrously quiet, rigid, slow in motion, without remainder, hard, brutally and without hesitation, loudly hard, juxtaposes, as in mathematics, the smallness of small foreign machines, the empty, pitiable, completely fragile, miserable, loudly roaring, painfully, visually pitiful, hard, fragile, small, ridiculous, inhuman smallness, with the objectively distant, tremendous, poignant, incontrovertible, powerful, overwhelming, indifferent, vast, absolute, blind, raging, ancient, primordial, wrathful, eternal, indifferent, rootless, cruel, plant-deprived, wild Mongolian desert steppes without borders, wild, untamed, frozen, hard, ancient Asian dead, without borders, eternal, cruel, indifferent, vast, legendary, fully winter, with ice, raw, unyielding, open to winds, the great, endless, without edges, hard, primordial, Mongolian, enormous, wild, empty, blind, enormous steppe of ice, which has without a word, alone, without hesitation, coldly, proudly, with pride and cold, in a frenzy, without scruple, indifferently, which firmly, with gravity, survived, enduring silently, conquered, rejected, and survived across time, hard, having defeated the arrogance of modern machines, utterly and without mercy.
The specially chosen and extremely carefully applied in this austere and cold visual creation, the professional, advanced, wide-angle optical lenses, in a very deliberately designed, strongly and extremely premeditated and artificial, almost maliciously unnatural manner, bend the sides very cruelly, unnaturally in the frame, deformed laterally, unnaturally, painfully, crookedly, unnaturally deform the edges cruelly, unnaturally, artificially, unnaturally, coldly bend spherically, deliberately distort the vision unnaturally, and sharply curve with the lens cruelly in the image the painful, unnaturally entire line of bending and refraction, unnaturally deform the perspective, aggressively curve the vision and bend unnaturally, brutally the foreign visual, painful, human, natural perspective and image, deform the geometry, sharp perspective and sharply artificially the foreign human painful broken natural unnatural geometry, sharply the view of perspective, casting a foreign cold perspective of space, the perspective of the lens in a manner mercilessly and firmly with great cold pressure, mercilessly immediately from above, coldly mercilessly hitting hard with pressure into the subconscious directly from the screen, mercilessly, absolutely sharply coldly and hard, with great pressure, without let-up, from inside cruelly and with resistance, coldly, brutally, objectively, from above, harshly, directly, mercilessly, unceremoniously, hitting brutally, firmly, very loudly, pressing, deliberately, from cold, directly, brutally, hitting with darkness, brutally, coldly, and with cold precision, in the mind, objectively forcing on the screen, forcing the unconscious, quiet, hidden viewer, the viewer who is watching, the viewer before the viewer, to the rapid surrender, forcing the viewer by force, forcing the imprisoned viewer mercilessly, loudly, forcing the caged viewer in the body to the shattering, sudden, dark, quiet, and fully terrifying and cold, painful, violent, quiet, in silence, rapid inner sensation, the sudden, internal, physical, hard, deep physical, suffocating, complete, cold, dark sensation of the lack of psychological air, the sudden, terrifying, sharp, quiet, strange, subterranean, claustrophobic entrapment of the viewer's consciousness, compelling him to confront the infinite, frozen, boundless, yet paradoxically suffocating space of the Mongolian steppe.
The absolute, cold, and powerful great phenomenon of the destroying and all-powerful atmosphere called the steppe zud, known here often by those few imprisoned on the plateau by its popular name with fear as the white, cruel, white, icy, lethal, white, powerful, white, cruel, inevitable, lethal, cold, epic, freezing, apocalyptic, white from above, blind in its indifference, powerful, raw, objective, heartless, white, dark, merciless, lethal, inexorable, so-called blind, destroying, icy, powerful, white, blind, absolute, white, objective, unyielding tyranny, fully the tyranny devoid of tyranny and frost of the tyranny of nature, with total and unconditional emptiness amidst the wind, loudly indifferent from ice, white tyranny, does not possess within itself, absolutely by its nature at all, does not possess and has not under its solid armor the smallest trace, does not conceal in the center within under the shield of wind, conceals absolutely nothing, does not possess, nor to its core in general, by definition cold and of ice, nor a trace any, none whatsoever of any human, programmed, conscious, warm, empty, wrathful, absolutely any, whatsoever hidden, cold, deliberate, soulless, absolutely any, evil, none blind to its core, conscious evil, hidden, conscious, loud, silent, hidden, none human and silent, none silent, dark, any evil, intentional evil, human and intentional evil, an intention of treachery or evil, foreign, intentional, and none calculated, conscious, foreign, intention of murder, wrath, intention of empty intention, consciousness, any hidden, plotted, premeditated, none inhuman, conscious, in general, any intention of action nor desire for murder, dark or malice, hidden, conscious intent of guilt, desire for murder, anger, hatred in the depth of consciousness, revenge, quiet or human angry, none human, any dark premeditated, nor malice, foreign, cold, empty, human, dark, revenge, cold, through and through empty. This powerful, terrifying phenomenon is, in its cold, destroying, solid frost nature, completely physically, objectively, painfully, coldly, blindly, in the laws completely terrifyingly, in essence, fully scientifically, fully forever, blindly, completely, coldly, absolutely indifferent, completely empty, indifferent, soullessly to the bone, simply coldly destroying, indifferent, completely without a word, mathematically and blindly to zero, from the outside completely indifferent, by its laws absolutely dead, completely and silently, powerfully, completely without a voice, inhumanly, by the whole, blindly, physically indifferent, completely objectively. It has no malice, no intent, no consciousness. It simply is, a force of nature, blind, absolute, and eternal.
In the great void, visible from afar on the edge of the powerful white horizon,
At a distance there appears a tiny, barely noted, wavering, very faint, pale, hidden, fragile, quiet, barely outlined, barely small and quiet, hidden, very small in the distance, extremely meager, small in the blizzard, slender, small, fine in outline, small, cold, fine from a distance, thin, hidden from afar, weak to the eye, revealing, weak from afar, small from the image, very extremely pale, weak, gray, minimal in shadow, fine and barely pale, visible, hidden, gray, hard to see, foreign, faint, gray, without substance, small, thin, hidden, quietly pale, very fine in shadow, frail, extremely delicate, extremely shy and delicate, very quiet, small, fragile, very weak and barely visible and frail on the wind, fine, thin, small, rare, delicate and weak, thin, fragile, like a thin thread from shadow, thin, live, like without a small, quiet strand, thin, rare, from ice, pale, quiet, thin, pale, rare, frail, thin, quiet, pale, gray, extremely on the sky, thin, fragile on the wind, rare, wavering, gray, like from dust, small from the background, rare, weak, pale and foreign, weak in the wind, pale, weak, gray, fragile and thin, dancing up top, loudly thrown, wavering, wildly vibrating in flight, torn hard, coldly, angrily on the wind, beaten strongly, emptily, thrown angrily, in a frenzy, dancing, noisily, sharply beaten, dancing, in whiteness, wavering, brutally in chaos, alone, quietly in the blizzard, tossed in the gale, blindly dancing, wildly in the fog, emptily, alone, in battle, thrown coldly, dancing, strongly torn, wildly beaten, emptily, on the powerful, roaring, cold, howling, hard, mercilessly in a frenzy, indifferent, powerful, empty, hard, blind through and through, windy, on the terrible, angry, frosty, sharp, destroying, deadly, hard, merciless, indifferent, cold, unyielding wind, a streak of gray, organic, foreign against a backdrop of ice, of organic, warm, hidden, gray from afar, gray, dark, hidden, slowly gray from white and from burning and smoke, visible from afar, hidden from smoke, fine, emptily smoke, deaf from a campfire, small in the distance, slow from darkness, warm smoke, and with wind thrown, gray smoke from a yurt. The smoke reveals the great truth of the will. We enter subliminally, smoothly, and without warning from above, slowly introducing an intimate, quiet, private, dark, hidden, forgotten, intimate, rare, closed, intimate, natively ancient, deeply human, warm, safe, old, hidden, human, warm, hidden on the steppe, a dimension close in spirit, natively, deeply secure, human, small, human and old, great, intimate, quiet and in the soul, ancient, warm, very from the heart and human, traditional, quiet, rare, from afar, ancient, deeply hidden, small, natively old, ancient and closed in the heart, hidden, quiet, ancient from the side, natively intimate, the dimension of a small, human, without loud glory, survival-filled dimension of an extraordinary old forgotten story, the Mongolian Gur.
With this inevitable, time-fleeing moment of darkness, sudden, quiet, cold, loud, wind, with wind, slow, inhuman, like from darkness, howling, roaring hard on the wind, roaring, destroying in a fraction, howling, coldly, empty and sharply, emptily, aggressively, coldly roaring, frenzied, sharply, aggressively destroying, loudly, quietly, after the wind with darkness, destroying, aggressive from below, howling, evil, howling from above, foreign, wind, roaring, destroying, slowly and angrily, reaches roaring, reaches hard,
absolutely in flight from cold, inexorably from the sky, reaches from cold, slowly hard on an axis, slowly in tempo with fury, slowly hard, mercilessly reaches, forever, quietly, slowly destroying, emptily, objectively, slowly, inevitably, darkly, angrily, hard and emptily with great force, reaches its summit, its hidden, darkest from above, blind, empty and blind, objective, great, quiet, cold, fully, indifferent, great, deepest, soulless, death, its black, quiet, blind, it's foreign, it's without loud, empty, cold, great, foreign, death, completely in the night, hidden, dark, darkest, without exit, it's in shadow, devoid of cold, completely coldest, blind, deepest, foreign, empty, death, without heart, hidden, nocturnal, powerful apogeum in the storm, frenzied apex, final, quiet, nocturnal, blind, loud from the cosmos, powerful, without light, powerful, deaf in the storm, nocturnal, hard, dark, quiet, hard, powerful apogeum, loudly nocturnal from above, apogeum, in fear, final and without heart, nocturnal, nocturnal powerful, blind powerful, frenzied death, nocturnal and angry apogeum in the storm, from ice, apogeum of winter, peak, with pain and the deaf, wretched and wholly fading cold, rare, pale, fading weak in the grip, weak and in the wind and painful, small and hidden, and small from the outline, and in the sun, last, faint, small, rare, hidden from a distance, fine, weak, invisible in twilight, short, small, last from the lens, and fragile in twilight, rare rays, quiet, quiet from above, and weak, cold, small rays of sunshine, from the west, short, rare, without strength and sunshine, rays extinguished, hidden, rays of sunshine, weak, from ice, rays, and of the stifled quiet, pale from ice, tired, in the fog, weak, fading, cold, distant, rare, cold, in the darkness, fogged from above, rare, foreign, cold, screened, cold, weak, foreign, dark, slow, weak, in flight, pale, foreign, muffled, very and distant, very weak and from ice, weak from below, shielded, pale, shielded from the wind, eclipsed, weak, muffled, fogged, grey, pale, foreign in the night, fogged, cold, muffled, rare, quiet, and in tones grey, forever light, rare, pale sunshine, fading sunshine, daytime light from the cosmos, daytime star, dark pale light, solar, definitively in the end, slowly, finally, objectively to zero, in darkness, definitively, inexorably, with a rush, irreversibly, permanently, without return, slowly, objectively, in darkness, completely, hard, without memory, finally, and to the bottom, inevitably, blindly, definitively, without return, without possibility, mercilessly, objectively, permanently, irrevocably, definitively, without exception, loudly, without exception, hard, in cold, without tears, yield to extinction. They sink, and slowly, loudly, mercilessly sink loudly, emptily, quietly, hard in a frenzy, deaf, swallowed to the bottom, emptily, swallowed from below to darkness, yield to complete swallowing, darkly, completely surrender and yield, emptily, loudly, without return, to shadow, slowly in whiteness to complete, absolute, without exception, blind in the night, all-encompassing, empty, without lights, blind, powerful, in the embrace, death, deep, indifferent, foreign, quiet, and empty, blind through to the end, absolute in embrace, blind from above, impenetrable and all-encompassing death, soullessly to the bone, dense, dark, pure from above, impenetrable in shadow, absolutely to darkness, to the objective of the night. The story suspends, ends and proudly suspends and ends in the void. And slowly the narrative stops in silence, quietly, with cold. The story of the white tyranny of the Mongolian winter draws to a close.
Chapter 2. The Hubris of Modern Engineering. The memory of the presentation hall was a stark, almost mocking contrast to the current reality, replaying in Alex's mind with the agonizing clarity of a fever dream. Exactly 3 months prior, standing beneath the warm, perfectly calibrated halogen lights of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Applied Materials Laboratory, Alex had been the undisputed king of his domain. The room had smelled faintly of ozone, fresh coffee, and the sterile, reassuring scent of highly filtered air. Before him sat a panel of investors and peer engineers, their faces illuminated by the colossal digital screen that displayed the schematic of his ultimate creation, the cryopod. Alex, dressed in a sharply tailored suit that projected an aura of infallible competence, had spoken with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted nature. For millennia, human beings have relied on passive, primitive structures to survive in extreme environments, he had declared, his voice echoing with unmistakable disdain as an image of a traditional canvas tent flashed on the screen, quickly replaced by a rotating three-dimensional rendering of his pod. We stacked rocks, we draped animal skins, we built rudimentary frames of wood. It was an era of surviving by the skin of our teeth, completely at the mercy of the elements. But, gentlemen, we are no longer bound by the limitations of the Bronze Age. The cryopod represents the absolute pinnacle of structural engineering and thermodynamic control. We are not just building a shelter, we are deploying a self-contained micro-atmospheric fortress. He had tapped a laser pointer against the screen, highlighting the intricate layers of the pod's shell. We are utilizing a proprietary multi-directional carbon fiber weave layered over a high-density aerogel insulation matrix. This structure possesses a tensile strength-to-weight ratio that makes steel look like wet paper. It doesn't just withstand extreme conditions, it actively nullifies them. The applause that followed had been intoxicating, a validation of his unwavering belief that sufficient technology, rigorous mathematical modeling, and synthetic materials were the ultimate definitive answer to any environmental challenge the planet could muster. Now, trapped within the very belly of that technological marvel on the unforgiving expanse of the Mongolian steppe, that applause was drowned out by a ceaseless, terrifying acoustic assault. The wind did not merely blow, it shrieked with the physical force of a solid object, a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated through every single atom of the pod. The acoustic dynamics inside the highly engineered dome had become an absolute nightmare. Because the cryopod had been designed to be an entirely rigid, unyielding structure, intended to deflect the wind shear rather than absorb or bend with it, it had inadvertently become a massive high-tech resonator.
The high-tension support cables, precisely calibrated in a wind tunnel under idealized, controlled laboratory conditions, were now singing with a chaotic, atonal vibration that seeped into Alex's bones, making his teeth ache and his vision blur. The wind, sweeping across thousands of miles of unobstructed frozen wasteland, hit the geometrically perfect angles of the pod and created violent micro-eddies of low pressure, pulling and tearing at the panels with a ferocity that his fluid dynamic simulations had utterly failed to predict. He was experiencing firsthand the fatal flaw of his hubris. He had built a structure that attempted to fight the steppe, to stand in arrogant, unyielding opposition to a force of nature that had been reshaping mountains for millions of years. And the steppe, indifferent and endlessly powerful, was effortlessly winning the war of attrition.
The first unmistakable sign of critical failure manifested not on the glowing screens of his diagnostic equipment, but with a sound that made Alex's blood run colder than the sub-zero air outside. It was a sharp, percussive crack, akin to the sound of a rifle firing in an enclosed space, cutting sharply through the continuous low-frequency drone of the storm. Alex scrambled toward the origin of the noise, his breath pluming in the increasingly chilly air of the interior. There, on the primary load-bearing strut, located on the windward side of the pod, a stress fracture had appeared. In the hyper-realistic high-dynamic range lighting of his headlamp, the microscopic failure of the material was devastatingly clear. The multi-directional carbon fiber weave, designed to distribute kinetic energy flawlessly, was unraveling at a molecular level. The extreme, sustained cold, currently sitting at a brutal -45 degrees Celsius, had fundamentally altered the physical properties of the proprietary epoxy resin matrix binding the carbon nanotubes. The resin had lost its crucial elasticity, becoming fatally brittle. As the unrelenting wind hammered the rigid exterior, the structure couldn't flex. It could only endure until the shear force exceeded the compromised material's breaking point. The fracture was currently small, a jagged, crystalline spiderweb spreading across the sleek black surface. But to an engineer like Alex, it was the structural equivalent of a terminal diagnosis. It was a glaring physical rebuke of his sterile laboratory mathematics, a chaotic variable that his pristine algorithms had arrogantly dismissed as statistically insignificant.
Desperation, heavily tinged with a furious, wounded pride, drove Alex back to his workstation. He threw himself into the ergonomic mesh-backed chair, his fingers flying across the keyboard of his ruggedized military-spec laptop. The multiple screens bathed the small, claustrophobic interior in a harsh, cold blue light, illuminating the deep, stress-induced shadows under his eyes. He furiously ran and re-ran the complex structural integrity simulations, inputting the live telemetry data streaming from the pod's external sensor array. The processors whirred, rendering highly detailed thermal and kinetic models in slow motion, visually demonstrating the precise vectors of the wind and the theoretical stress distribution. But the math simply did not match the horrifying empirical reality unfolding around him. The simulation showed the pod holding perfectly stable, the load distributed evenly across the aerogel matrix. "It's impossible," Alex muttered to himself, his voice strained and hoarse, entirely lacking the smooth confidence of his MIT presentation. "The coefficient of thermal expansion is completely within the established safety parameters. The wind shear is barely brushing 80 knots. The material shouldn't be failing. It must be an unprecedented meteorological anomaly, a freak confluence of atmospheric pressure and hyperlocalized temperature drops." He desperately clung to his lab-based worldview, his ego demanding that the environment be at fault, not his design. He could not accept that the holistic, messy, unpredictable reality of the Mongolian winter could simply overpower a design born from millions of dollars of research and development.
As if the structural degradation wasn't enough to induce a panic attack, the pod's internal climate control system decided to simultaneously demonstrate its own fatal vulnerabilities. The cryopod had eschewed simple passive insulation in favor of an immensely complex active thermodynamic heating system, heavily reliant on highly refined liquid fuel in miniature combustion chambers. It was designed to maintain a perfect, comfortable 21 degrees Celsius regardless of the external conditions. However, the system's intricate network of microvalves, thermal sensors, and precise fuel injectors was completely unprepared for the reality of sustained, profound cold. The high-grade synthetic lubricant within the primary fuel pump, rated for incredibly low temperatures, had nonetheless begun to crystallize under the relentless thermal drain. The smooth, reassuring hum of the heater sputtered, dropping an octave into a sickly mechanical grinding noise that reverberated through the metal floor grating. Alex watched in mounting horror as the digital readout on the primary life support monitor showed the internal ambient temperature plummeting. 20 degrees, 15, 10. The high-tech system, requiring precise conditions to operate its delicate components, was entering a cascading failure loop. It was attempting to draw more fuel to compensate for the drop in heat, which was only freezing the overtaxed pump faster. It was a spectacular display of engineered fragility, a system so advanced and complex that a single unforeseen environmental variable could bring the entire multi-million-dollar apparatus crashing down. Shivering violently, his fine motor skills rapidly deteriorating as the ambient temperature inside the pod approached freezing, Alex attempted a desperate, makeshift repair. He opened a heavy, insulated emergency kit and pulled out a dual syringe of advanced high-tensile aerospace epoxy, intending to patch the expanding stress fracture on the carbon fiber strut. His hands, usually so steady and precise when manipulating microcircuitry, were now shaking uncontrollably from a combination of adrenaline and the biting cold. He clumsily mixed the two chemical components, watching the gray paste form, but the moment he applied the compound to the freezing surface of the damaged strut, the chemical reality of a situation dealt him another crushing blow. The epoxy, an absolute marvel of modern chemical engineering, required a minimum ambient temperature of 10 degrees Celsius to initiate its catalytic curing process. Here, applied to a surface that was radiating the minus 45-degree cold of the exterior storm, the paste simply froze solid instantly, turning into a useless, brittle crust that flaked away when he touched it. The irony was suffocating. He possessed the most advanced materials known to human science, but they were entirely dependent on the artificial, controlled laboratory conditions he could no longer provide. He was surrounded by the absolute pinnacle of human technological achievement, yet he was rapidly becoming as helpless as a man caught in a blizzard wearing nothing but a cotton shirt.
The compounding failures triggered a severe secondary crisis, catastrophic power drain. The entire philosophy behind the cryopod was based on active resistance, relying on an enormous array of high-density lithium-ion batteries to power the heating systems, the structural tension monitors, the environmental sensors, and the communication arrays. But thermodynamics is an unforgiving master. The extreme cold was rapidly slowing the chemical reactions within the battery cells, effectively slashing their total capacity by more than 60%. As the failing heater desperately drew maximum amperage to keep the pump from seizing entirely, the battery levels displayed on the main console entered a terrifying freefall. The sleek, modern interior of the pod, once a beacon of technological triumph, began to systematically shut down non-essential systems to preserve life support. First, the secondary monitors went black. Then the main overhead LED arrays dimmed to a sickly pale glow before shutting off completely, leaving only the harsh, pulsating red emergency lighting. The transition was psychologically devastating. The sterile, hypermodern laboratory environment was instantly transformed into a claustrophobic, freezing metal coffin. The shadows deepened, dancing erratically in the red light, emphasizing the smallness of the space and the overwhelming, crushing magnitude of the storm raging just millimeters away on the other side of the failing composite hull. Defeated, exhausted, and feeling the very real, creeping lethargy of hypothermia setting into his extremities, Alex pushed himself away from the dead consoles. He wrapped a heavy, mylar-lined thermal blanket around his shaking shoulders and stumbled toward the pod's single, thick observation porthole. He needed to look outside, perhaps to judge the severity of the storm, or perhaps simply to find some visual anchor in the chaotic nightmare his expedition had become. He wiped the condensation from the multi-paned glass and peered out into the brutal, hyper-realistic landscape. It was dusk, the absolute worst time on the steppe. The sky was a bruised, terrifying canvas of deep indigos and slate grays, completely obscured by the horizontal sheets of blowing snow. The wind was whipping the dry, crystalline snow across the frozen earth, creating an atmospheric particle effect that looked like a river of white fire flowing over the ground. Wide-angle lens flares from the dying anemic sun refracted through the suspended ice crystals, casting long, dramatic shadows that emphasized the vast, overwhelming, and utterly indifferent scale of the Mongolian wilderness. It was a landscape of brutal, terrible beauty, a place that cared absolutely nothing for carbon fiber, aerogel, or the arrogant mathematics of men from Cambridge. And then, as he stared out into the freezing void, a subtle anomaly caught his eye, breaking the relentless horizontal motion of the storm. Far in the distance, barely visible through the swirling, chaotic blizzard, there was a steady, vertical interruption against the dark sky. Alex squinted, his breath fogging the glass again, forcing him to wipe it frantically with his trembling sleeve. It wasn't an illusion. It was a thin, persistent plume of smoke. It rose steadily, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible tint of warm orange from a hidden fire below, contrasting violently with the freezing blue palette of the dying day. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Out there, in the very heart of this unsurvivable meteorological anomaly that was systematically dismantling his multi-million-dollar masterpiece, someone was surviving. Not just surviving, but keeping a fire lit. The smoke spoke of a shelter that was holding together, of an environment that was being managed without complex fuel pumps, lithium-ion batteries, or carbon fiber weaves. As Alex stared at that distant, primitive beacon, a complex storm of emotions raged within him. His profound frustration at his own failure battled with a deeply bruised, monumental ego. But rising above the annoyance and the despair was a reluctant, desperate, and entirely unscientific curiosity. He realized, with a bitter pill of humility, that whoever had built the structure beneath that smoke understood something fundamental about this brutal world that all his lab-based hubris had entirely missed.
Chapter 3: An Invitation in the Storm.
The wind over the Mongolian steppe, in the very heart of this unimaginably brutal, anomalous winter, had ceased to be merely an ordinary meteorological phenomenon. It had evolved into a merciless, primal force of nature, an untamed beast whose pure, destructive kinetic energy seemed to have one cruel goal: to level with the ground everything that dared to challenge its absolute dominion. The landscape, illuminated only by the ghostly cold glow of the moon penetrating through dense cloud layers, presented itself in a truly cinematic, hyper-realistic aesthetic of an extremely high tonal dynamic range, where freezing, penetrating blues and blinding, sterile whites created a landscape from an alien, extremely inhospitable planet.
Every single snowflake, carried at a speed exceeding 120 kilometers per hour, became a microscopic crystalline blade that with near mechanical precision sculpted and polished the steel-hard surface of the frozen earth, creating swirling, hypnotic fractals of ice drifting in the air like millions of sparks in a lethal dance. Inside the futuristic shelter, proudly named the cryopod, an atmosphere dense with mounting claustrophobic terror prevailed, which with every second evaporated from the crew's minds the last remnants of illusory confidence built on advanced technology. Alex, the chief engineer, brilliant architect and visionary of this multi-million-dollar, supposedly indestructible project, stared with growing disbelief at the holographic monitors whose interfaces flickered with aggressive warning red, signaling critical overloads in every possible sector of the structure. The interior of the module, initially designed as an oasis of absolute safety, had now become an arena for a desperate battle of algorithms against raw physics. Servo mechanisms wailed with a terrifying metallic screech, trying to compensate for the gigantic wind stresses, while strain sensors in real time drew on the screens graphs resembling seismograph readings of an earthquake of unprecedented magnitude. The contrast between the cool, precise, almost sterile technology of the interior and the wild, incalculable, uncontrollable fury of the external world was becoming painfully palpable, highlighting the human arrogance that had led them to believe they could tame nature using polymers, titanium alloys, and advanced mathematical equations. The main load-bearing pillar of the structure, built from revolutionary titanium alloys reinforced with carbon nanotubes, began to slowly, inexorably yield.
With a deafening thunderclap strikingly resembling the detonation of a powerful vacuum bomb in an enclosed space, the hermetic integrity of the advanced shelter was finally, irreversibly, and catastrophically breached. The icy wind, carrying dense, stone-frozen crystalline clouds of snow, burst into the interior through a powerful, jagged rupture with such fury that it instantly equalized the pressure differential, hurling lighter pieces of equipment through the air like toys in the hands of a raging child. The temperature inside the cryopod, until now maintained at an optimal level thanks to complex life support systems, plummeted by several dozen degrees within just a few seconds, instantly crystallizing the moisture in the air and depositing frost on the monitor screens, which now, instead of saving lives, were becoming nothing but useless, freezing panels of glass. The blinding, chaotic blizzard penetrated into every corner of the space, creating a swirling chaos of zero visibility in which the team members desperately shouted to each other, though their voices were instantly snatched away and muffled by the roar of the elements. The physical impact of the extreme cold was like a blow from a bludgeon. It paralyzed the nervous system, instantly stole warmth from human bodies, initiating convulsions, while razor-sharp ice particles mercilessly lacerated every exposed inch of skin, forcing the crew to confront the immediate specter of hypothermia and certain death. When hope seemed entirely extinguished and deep hypothermia was beginning slowly but effectively to numb their terrified minds, inducing in them the dangerous, deceptively calm state of lethal apathy, from the blinding white of the howling blizzard, two shapes suddenly emerged. Initially, in Alex's perception, distorted by cold and exhaustion, they looked like hallucinations, ghostly spirits of the steppe formed from the whirling snow and ice. But as the figures slowly, yet with remarkable, unwavering certainty of step, approached the ruined shelter, it became apparent that these were living people. Batbayar, an ancient-looking nomad, and his young son, both of them completely ignored by the surrounding apoleptic element. They moved through deep drifts with a grace and calm that defied all laws of logic.
There followed a moment full of inexpressible, dense tension, lasting in the subjective perception of the frozen scientists an entire freezing eternity in which the howl of the wind seemed for a moment to fall silent in their minds. In that 1 second, suspended in time and space, Alex, kneeling in the snow inside his ruined life's work, had to fight the most difficult, most brutal battle of his life so far, a battle with his own inflated ego and the rationalism of a scientist. Entrusting his fate and the lives of the entire team to the hands of an unknown old man in a leather coat meant the ultimate admission of the absolute failure of his multi-million-dollar corporate-sponsored prototype. It meant the brutal deconstruction of his entire worldview. On one hand, the pride of the architect still cried out, commanding him at any cost to save at least the data carriers and surviving components. On the other, however, the oldest, most powerful instinct in the universe made itself heard, the will to survive, suggesting to him clearly that if they remained in this titanium tin can for another 5 minutes, they would freeze to the bone. Bhatbayar uttered not a single word. His face expressed neither sympathy nor triumph. He simply, with majestic, slow composure, raised his thick-gloved hand and made one spare but utterly authoritative gesture, demanding their immediate compliance. The decision was made not through loud commands or lengthy risk analyses, which no one would have heard or understood anyway in the deafening roar of the enraged storm, but through the slow, completely resigned, and deeply humble nod of Alex's head. The team, seeing the capitulation of their informal leader, immediately and almost with relief abandoned all futile, exhausting attempts to save the equipment and seal the cracked bulkheads. A hasty, nervous evacuation began, grabbing only what was absolutely essential for short-term survival, ignoring laptops worth tens of thousands of dollars and unique scientific instruments now possessing the value of nothing but a pile of useless dead trash. The abandonment of the shelter was an act of almost symbolic dimensions, a step toward the unknown, toward the ancient wisdom of those who had always known the true nature of this land.
When the physical and psychological senses of the barely standing expedition members finally began to capitulate catastrophically before the unimaginable cold, and the hallucinations from hypothermia became more and more insistent, in the sterile, freezing air there unexpectedly appeared the first anomalous spark of hope. It was a smell, thick, archaic, burning in frozen nostrils, but at this specific moment unimaginably enticing, almost divine. The scent of burning, seasoned willow wood mingled with the aroma of dried animal dung, argol, the basic fuel for survival on the steppe. This primal olfactory stimulus acted on the numbed minds of the scientists more powerfully than any advanced medical stimulant. It broke through the barrier of physical exhaustion and apathy, activating the oldest neural pathways of evolution, for which the smell of smoke had for millennia meant one most important word: life. A moment later, in the distance, through the dense, impenetrable curtain of snow swirling at dizzying speed, a faint, barely perceptible, but how beautiful glow began to break through. A warm, pulsating golden radiance that created an absolutely breathtaking cinematic contrast with the cold, brutal blues and grays of the surrounding icy hell. For the desperate people, this indistinct flickering point of warm light suddenly became the navel of the universe, the ultimate goal of their murderous march, adding to their cold, constricted muscles the last, stored in the deepest reserves of the organism, portion of energy needed to cover the remaining meters. Approaching slowly and with inhuman effort through the curtain of densely falling snow, the wanderers finally made out the clear, rounded silhouettes of several traditional Jur dwellings. Their organic, perfectly aerodynamic shape, refined through hundreds of years of empirical experience on the most windswept plains of the planet, seemed, in Alex's slow-motion analytical mind, to mock the angular, complex optimization algorithm-based forms of the destroyed cryocod.
While the titanium walls of the modern module had tried to offer hard frontal resistance to nature's might, which ultimately led to their spectacular fracture from material fatigue, the smooth, domed surfaces of the jurs elegantly disperse the wind's blows, allowing air streams to flow around them without creating destructive vacuum zones. It was a brilliant in its simplicity lesson in airflow thermodynamics and advanced biomechanical construction, a structure that does not shout about dominance over the environment, but harmoniously integrates into it, bending and working with each gust rather than breaking in uncompromising rigidity.
Chapter 4. Crossing the Threshold. Step by step, the space around Alex ceased to exist as a three-dimensional reality, transforming into an absolutely flat, blindingly white void in which every direction seemed equally lethal and devoid of meaning. The blizzard that had unleashed over the Mongolian steppe was not simply an atmospheric phenomenon, it was a brutal physical force, a roaring ocean of kinetic energy that sought to erase all life from the face of the earth. The hurricane-force wind carried with it billions of microscopic, razor-sharp ice crystals that at incredible velocity struck every unprotected millimeter of skin, cutting like miniature scalpels. The wide-angle perspective of this nightmare, were anyone able to capture it from outside, would have revealed only a boundless, chaotic blizzard in shades of freezing blue and dead white, with just two microscopic, dark specks trying to oppose the apocalyptic fury of nature. Visibility dropped to barely a few centimeters, making Alex feel as if enclosed in a claustrophobic, freezing cage from which there was no escape. The roar of the wind was so deafening that it resembled a jet engine starting up directly alongside, completely drowning his own desperate attempts to catch his breath and making the eardrums vibrate with pain at every violent gust. This was no longer a walk, it was a fight for survival in the most austere, merciless environment imaginable, where the slightest error, a stumble or loss of orientation, would mean certain, inevitable death under drifts of eternal snow. The biomechanics of the human body, created for free movement, in these extreme conditions underwent complete and painful degradation, forcing Alex to move in an unnatural manner, reminiscent of a broken machine whose lubricants had frozen at a temperature far below zero. Each step required superhuman effort, as if his legs were submerged in thick, rapidly setting concrete, and powerful wind gusts ceaselessly tried to knock him off his feet. His breath, instead of supplying life-giving oxygen, became another source of torment. The icy air invaded his lungs like broken glass, triggering painful bronchospasms. The only point of reference in the absolute overwhelming whiteness were the unwavering silhouettes of the nomads walking ahead, moving with impossible certainty through a storm that should have been impassable. When the senses of hearing and touch began slowly adapting to a new, diametrically different reality, releasing him from the grip of hypothermic panic, Alex's nostrils were attacked by a dense, extremely rich and complex composition of aromas that definitively sealed his escape from the sterile, odorless, icy desert. The main, dominant note was the sharp yet simultaneously incredibly pleasant aroma of burning willow wood and dried animal dung, argol, the traditional fuel of the nomads, whose combustion in the central hearth generated not only intense heat, but also a specific resinous smoke that settled on every element of the interior, lending it a characteristic patina and scent. Beneath this layer of smoke hid the deep, meaty smell of fatty mutton stew, horhog, boiling in a large cauldron, whose thick, nourishing broth filled the entire space of the yurt with the promise of replenishing Alex's dramatically depleted caloric reserves, triggering in him an involuntary hungry stomach spasm, having eaten nothing warm for over a day. Added to this bouquet was the delicate, sweetly salty aroma of heated milk and burnt butter, elements inextricably linked to Mongolian culinary culture.
together creating a mixture so domestic, intimate, and rooted in organic life that it constituted the absolute antithesis of the dead, inorganic cold of the external blizzard. The view from a first-person perspective, as Alex finally rubbed his frosted eyes, revealed an interior of extraordinary visual coherence, captured as if by a camera equipped with an extremely shallow depth of field lens, where the central point, burning bright orange like a small sun, was the steel stove with its thick chimney pipe conducting smoke through the central opening in the roof, the tonneau. All around this red-hot nucleus spread an extremely well-considered geometric structure of the dwelling. The flexible wooden lattice walls, khana, forming a circular frame of precisely roped-together slats, painted a deep, sacred shade of red with intricate golden patterns woven in, gleaming in the flickering firelight like relics from the era of Genghis Khan's empire. Upward from the walls, dozens of long, slender roof poles, uni, converged toward the center at a perfect angle, meeting in the central ring of the tonneau with a precision that would not shame a modern architect using advanced software. And the entire structure constituted a brilliant self-supporting framework, balancing compressive and tensile forces without a single nail.
Chapter 5. The Walls That Breathe and Bend.
When the hurricane-force wind with unchecked fury struck the vast Mongolian steppe, the world outside transformed into a swirling, icy hell, and the powerful blizzard instantly erased from the horizon all points of reference. The landscape, usually austere, infinitely quiet and majestic, now resembled a chaotic, abstract vision, painted exclusively in shades of terrifying cold white and dark navy blue that merged into one horrifying spectacle of destruction. The wind was no longer merely a meteorological phenomenon. In this boundless space devoid of any natural barriers, it had taken the form of a physical, almost palpable beast that with a murderous low howl rolled through the flat kilometers of frozen earth, gaining speed and unimaginable power with every meter covered. The cinematic camera's imagined lens, recording the scene in a hyper-realistic vision of high dynamic range, would have captured the merciless, brutal poetry of this extreme atmospheric phenomenon. In drastic, almost shocking sensory contrast to the murderous, icy hell raging outside, the interior of the yurt was bathed in rich, calming, deep colors of warm orange, intense red, and muted brown, creating an intimate bubble of survival amidst winter. The space, recorded with an extremely shallow depth of field, concentrated all visual and emotional attention on the central hearth, which constituted not only the physical heart of this dwelling, but the pulsating source of life defying the freezing death lurking just beyond the thin layer of felt. The golden light of dancing flames softly flowed around the curved surfaces, revealing from the semi-darkness the rich, organic details, the thick, fibrous weave of the woolen felt covering the walls, the gleaming, taut camel leather straps, and the aged, smoke and time-patinated arrangement of the willow wood grain from which the framework was built. For Alex, sitting at a safe distance from the hearth, this visual piece was merely an illusion, a fragile facade behind which lurked paralyzing fear. His engineering mind could not stop analyzing. How was it possible that this structure, so archaic in appearance, built from wood and wool and animal leather, not only survived the Zood intact, but provided warmth and comfort where all his cutting-edge, multi-million-dollar technology had failed completely and catastrophically?
Chapter 6. Ideal Koch.
Zewnętrzny świat za ścianami mongolskiej jurty stanowił bezlitosną, mrozną pustynię, po której hulał wiatr o sile zdolnej powalić dorosłego człowieka, niosąc ze sobą ostre jak brzytwa kryształki lodu, które uderzały o zewnętrzną powłokę schronienia z dźwiękiem przypominającym uderzenia milionów mikroskopijnych igieł, tworząc akustyczną symfonię absolutnego zniszczenia i termicznej śmierci. Wewnątrz jednak panowała niewiarygodna wręcz cisza, a rozgrzane do czerwoności żeliwne palenisko rzucało na ściany ciepłe, migotliwe światło, które tańczyło na chropowatej powierzchni materiału izolacyjnego, wydobywając z niego niesamowitą organiczną fakturę. Alex siedział w bezruchu na niskim drewnianym stolku, wciąż nie mogąc w pełni pojąć, jak to możliwe, że ta pozornie prymitywna konstrukcja potrafi oprzeć się potędze syberyjskiego wyżu, który na zewnątrz sprowadzał temperaturę do poziomu, w którym zamarzała ludzka krew. Jego uwaga skupiła się na wewnętrznym poszyciu ścian, grubej warstwie filcu, znanej wśród koczowników jako des, która opasała całe wnętrze niczym ramiona troskliwego giganta. Powoli, niczym badacz zbliżający się do nieznanego, pozaziemskiego artefaktu, wyciągnął dłoń ubraną w ultranowoczesną, syntetyczną rękawicę termiczną z wbudowanymi sensorami i dotknął materiału. Obiektyw jego umysłu zdawał się rejestrować ten obraz w kinowej, niemal hiperrealistycznej jakości z niezwykle płytką głębią ostrości, w której tło rozmywało się w plamy złotego światła, a na pierwszym planie królowała surowa, szorstka faktura owczej wełny. To nie był tylko zwykły materiał, to była bariera oddzielająca kruche ludzkie życie od natychmiastowej śmierci z wychłodzenia, stworzona bez użycia skomplikowanych przemysłowych procesów chemicznych, bez wielomilionowych nakładów na badania i rozwój w sterylnych laboratoriach, a jednocześnie działająca z niezawodnością i precyzją, której mogliby pozazdrościć najlepsi inżynierowie materiałowi na świecie. Powietrze wewnątrz jurty było gęste, ciepłe, wypełnione zapachem palonego drewna, gotowanej herbaty i specyficznym, surowym, zwierzęcym aromatem, który teraz przestał być drażnić, a stał się obietnicą bezpieczeństwa i ocalenia w środku mrożnego piekła. Fascynacja Alexa rosła z każdą sekundą, gdy w końcu zdecydował się zdjąć swoją zaawansowaną technologicznie rękawicę ochronną, odsłaniając bladą, wciąż lekko zmarzniętą skórę dłoni. Przesunął nagimi palcami po nierównej, grudkowatej powierzchni filcu, wyczuwając pod opuszkami jego niezwykłą, zwartą gęstość, strukturę tak mocno zbitą, że wydawała się niemal lita ściana, a jednocześnie zachowującą właściwości sprężystej, miękkiej tkaniny. Poczuł na skórze delikatny, tłusty osad, naturalną lanolinę z potu i gruczołów owiec, która nie tylko spajała włókna, ale również działała jak doskonały środek hydrofobowy, odpychający wilgoć i zapobiegający gniciu materiału przez stałe dziesięciolecia użytkowania na surowym stepie. Zbliżył twarz do ściany, wdychając głęboko ten pradawny zapach, zapach przetrwania tysięcy pokoleń koczowników, którzy ufali tej barierze bardziej niż czemukolwiek innemu na świecie. Filc pod jego palcami nie był zimny, nie wysysał ciepła z jego ciała tak, jak robiłby to metal, czy nawet supernowoczesne kompozyty plastikowe w jego kombinezonie ratunkowym po kontakcie z chłodem. Lecz natychmiast odpowiadał ciepłem, odbijając temperaturę jego własnego ciała niczym termiczne lustro. Każde przesunięcie dłoni wywoływało delikatny szelest miliona ściśniętych włókien, dźwięk, który w umyśle Alexa przerodził się w głuchą, pełną szacunku świadomość, że dotyka czegoś, co w swojej istocie przewyższa wszystko, co zostało wyprodukowane w sterylnych warunkach współczesnego przemysłu. Ten prymitywny, tłusty, ciężki i szorstki koc był niezniszczalnym pancerzem przed mrozem. Siedząc tam w mrocznym, nasyconym pomarańczowym światłem wnętrze jurty, umysł Alexa nieuchronnie poszybował wstecz do sterylnych, oświetlonych chłodnym niebieskim światłem.
Chapter 7. The Crown of the Heavens.
The narrative opens with a profound, almost jarring juxtaposition between the brutal, unforgiving Mongolian steppe outside and the sanctuary of the Gur's interior, a contrast that serves as the foundation for Alex's impending epiphany. Alex sits cross-legged on a vividly patterned ancient rug, the coarse, dense fibers of the woolen felt pressing against his cold, stiffened leather boots as he deeply observes the absolute heart of this resilient nomadic dwelling, the central stove. The metallic belly of this modest utilitarian stove glows with a furious cherry-red heat, acting as a stark, localized sun that relentlessly radiates life-saving thermal energy into the intimately scaled circular room.
Outside the meticulously constructed walls, the relentless winter blizzard howls with a high-pitched, almost demonic shriek, an auditory testament to a hostile environment where temperatures routinely plummet well below -40 degrees Celsius, a realm where the very atmosphere feels like shattered, microscopic glass scraping against any exposed human skin. Yet within this perfectly circular haven, the atmosphere is steeped in a rich, enveloping warmth, visually rendered in deep, comforting hues of burnt orange, glowing ochre, and earthy, warm browns that push back against the psychological weight of the cold. The cinematic lens of his observation, operating with a hyper-realistic clarity and a shallow depth of field, focuses intently on the crystalline, geometric structure of a single stray snowflake that has managed to hitch a ride on his collar, watching it melt into a glistening bead of water instantly as it encounters the radiant heat, before the focus smoothly shifts to the glowing, crackling embers within the iron cast. The most astonishing realization slowly yet forcefully dawns upon Alex's rigorously trained, mathematically inclined scientific mind. Despite the aggressive open combustion of dried yak dung and scrub wood occurring within the open-faced stove, there is an absolute, inexplicable, and almost magical absence of smoke lingering anywhere within the living space. The air he draws into his lungs is remarkably crisp, carrying only the faintest, pleasant olfactory traces of toasted wild tea and aged fire-warmed willow wood, but it remains entirely devoid of the acrid, heavy, eye-watering haze one would logically and historically expect from a traditional indoor fire pit. This profound atmospheric clarity within such a geographically isolated, tightly contained, and heavily insulated structural environment directly contradicts his initial, perhaps slightly arrogant, Western assumptions of primitive, archaic living conditions. He begins to realize, with a creeping sense of profound awe, that the gur is not merely a tent designed to block the wind. It is a meticulously calibrated, highly sophisticated thermodynamic machine, an architectural organism breathing and exhaling with a silent, invisible, and flawless rhythm that completely defies the chaotic, freezing tempest raging just millimeters beyond its protective, felt-lined walls. Driven by this startling realization, Alex tilts his head back, his eyes tracing a visual journey upward from the furiously burning embers, following the invisible trajectory of the heat. The cinematic composition of his gaze acts as a slow, deliberate pan across the interior architecture, eventually locking on to the apex of the structure, the circular wooden ring known as the tonneau, sitting majestically at the dead center of the conical roof, completely open to the unforgiving heavens. This shot, framed perfectly from the low angle of the floor, captures a breathtaking dance of physics and visual poetry as a thick blue-gray ribbon of smoke rises from the stove. It does not waver, it does not billow haphazardly into the room. Rather, it coalesces into a perfectly defined, tightly woven pillar of particulate matter that swirls upwards in an elegant, unbroken helical
Chapter 8. Lighter than a prototype.
The hurricane blizzard that had mercilessly lashed the Mongolian steppe for the last several days had finally relented, leaving behind an absolute, almost deafening silence that for Alex was just as shocking as the earlier roar of the wind. When he opened his eyes, the interior of the yurt was filled with soft, golden morning light filtering through the central smoke opening tonneau, creating in the dust and burning wood scent saturated air an almost physically tangible column of radiance. The cinematic, hyper-realistic quality of this morning struck all the senses at once. The high tonal dynamic range of the landscape was so intense as to be almost painful to eyes accustomed to the darkness and gray of the snowstorm. When Alex peered outside through the low wooden door, he saw a world completely transformed,
frozen in a brutal yet breathtaking beauty, where the rays of the rising sun gleamed on the fresh, undisturbed snow, creating millions of sparkling, crystalline reflections. The wide-angle perspective of this site was overwhelming in scale. The boundless steppe stretched to the very horizon, and the sharp light of dawn cast long, dramatic shadows, highlighting every, even the smallest unevenness of the terrain. The air was so freezing that every breath instantly transformed into a dense cloud of vapor. The contrast between the deadly blue-white cold prevailing outside and the cozy orange-brown interior of the shelter made the engineer realize how fragile, yet simultaneously how powerful a barrier was the structure that had saved their lives. When the family gathered for morning tea, Botbayar announced calmly, with complete absence of emotion, that the time had come to set out in search of better pastures. Alex, whose engineering mind immediately began working at full speed, felt a sudden surge of adrenaline and mild panic at the very thought of the logistical nightmare that moving an entire dwelling must be after such a devastating storm. In his head immediately began to take shape complex Gantt charts and diagrams. He imagined that this operation would take at least several days. But the nomads finished their salty drink with undisturbed calm, as if planning merely a short walk, not the relocation of their entire universe in extreme subarctic conditions. This cognitive dissonance between his Western expectations and their nomadic nonchalance filled him with deep disorientation.
Chapter 9. Wisdom Woven Through Time.
Night over the Mongolian steppe descended with an unimaginable weight and boundless depth that Alex had never before experienced in his orderly urban life. The sky, completely free from any artificial light pollution, had become a hypnotizing, three-dimensional ocean of stars in which the Milky Way pulsed with a cool, pearly radiance, creating a luminous river cutting across the ink-black void of the cosmos. The external world was a realm of absolute frost and icy silence, captured in hyper-realistic details, where every single snow crystal on the frozen earth seemed to reflect cosmic light like a microscopic diamond, creating a sparkling carpet stretching to the horizon. From the perspective of a virtual wide-angle lens, the new camp was merely a microscopic speck in this majestic, overwhelming landscape, and the solitary yurt constituted a fragile white hemisphere abandoned to the mercy of brutal natural forces. The icy wind, carrying the penetrating scent of distant glaciers and raw earth, struck the woolen walls with a force that in other circumstances would have induced paralyzing terror, yet the organic construction merely quietly groaned, absorbing and dispersing kinetic energy with astonishing grace. The contrast between the murderous cold and this tiny asylum was so sharp as to be almost physically painful. The sharp blue light of the stars painted long, harsh shadows on the surface of the glazed snow, accentuating the rough texture of the frozen grass and the brutality of an environment that forgave not even the slightest mistake. Inside the shelter, the intimate, warm world felt almost supernaturally safe by contrast. The golden, flickering light of the fire danced on the curved walls, painting the space in the richest tones of deep orange, vibrant red, and earthy brown, creating an atmosphere of absolute safety and primal comfort. Dense, aromatic clouds of steam from the boiling tea drifted upward through the smoke hole, catching the reflections of the flames like golden dust. This extraordinary shelter was not merely a physical barrier against the cold, but almost a living organism, breathing and pulsating to the rhythm of the crackling logs, enveloping its inhabitants in a cocoon of sensory warmth. In the vast immensity of that dark night, Alex understood something profound about the relationship between human ingenuity and the natural world.
Chapter 10. Repaired by the Land. The process of dismantling the yurt was like a precisely choreographed ballet in which every, even the smallest movement had its strictly defined place, purpose, and time. Yet in this austere, unpredictable environment, even the most tradition-hallowed procedures sometimes encountered the resistance of matter itself. It was at this critical moment, as the nimble hands of the nomads untied the successive leather straps maintaining the structure in perfect balance, that a sound rang out, which in any engineer triggers an immediate instinctive unease. It was a sharp, dry crack of breaking wood, the sound of torn fibers, that brutally interrupted the rhythmic rush of wind and quiet conversations. Alex froze, and his gaze immediately traveled toward the source of this troubling sound. In the lower section of the khana, the intricate crisscross lattice of willow wood forming the main load-bearing framework of the wall, one of the spans had been damaged. The break was deep, irregular, running along the natural grain of the wood, exposing the bright, as yet unweathered interior of the branch, which sharply contrasted with the dark, smoke and years of use saturated surface of the rest of the structure. For Alex, raised in a culture of technological perfectionism and modular solutions, this sight was equivalent to a structural catastrophe. In his mind immediately began to emerge risk assessment algorithms and calculations of load-bearing capacity loss. Yet Bayar reacted with complete, almost stoic calm, the absolute antithesis of the Western engineer's panic. The old nomad approached the damaged spot, slowly and carefully ran his calloused, old parchment-like hands over the broken fibers as if reading the history of the damage from them, then lightly nodded his head without uttering a single word. There was not a shred of irritation, frustration, or hurry in his behavior. The damage to the material was for him simply another natural stage in the life cycle of an object, an event as obvious and predictable as the change of seasons. Instead of searching for complex repair kits or epoxy resins, Bayar simply turned and set off toward the open, boundless steppe. He returned minutes later carrying a branch of willow wood, flexible, fresh, alive, which he had found exactly where it needed to be found, in the earth itself. And in 15 minutes, using only his belt knife and a length of camel hair rope, he had repaired the damage completely. Alex watched in stunned silence, beginning to understand that the true genius of the Jur lay not only in its design, but in its profound compatibility with the world that surrounded it.
Chapter 11. The 5 Criteria of Genius.
The interior of Alex's ruined, though provisionally patched tent formed a grim, claustrophobic backdrop for his blossoming thoughts, creating a drastic contrast with the brutal beauty of the Mongolian steppe raging outside. The icy wind howled like a starving beast, striking the thin, synthetic walls that trembled and stretched in a spasmodic rhythm, reminding him mercilessly of the absolute fragility of modern technologies in the face of the primal, unbridled power of nature. In the light of a small headlamp creating a warm, golden, yet desperately limited island of survival in a sea of all-encompassing darkness, Alex sat wrapped in everything he had managed to salvage from the equipment. The lens of his internal perception focused with shallow depth of field on the destroyed notebook resting on his trembling knees, ignoring the surrounding chaos. The air inside was horrifyingly dense with his own rapidly freezing breath, which in near slow motion was settling on the cold nylon walls in the form of gleaming, treacherous frost. Despite the physical, bone-chilling discomfort, his mind burned with the fever of pure analytical revelation. He reached for a pencil whose graphite gleamed in the torchlight, and on a clean white page, amidst the deafening hum of the wind, drew with a firm, trembling, yet almost reverent motion the heading that was to change his perception of survival engineering forever: the Gur. This was no longer merely an exotic tent of distant eastern nomads for him. It was an object of the deepest, most fascinating engineering study, an artifact of ultimate evolutionary perfection, which at this very moment, on the pages of his notebook, he intended to mercilessly disassemble into its component parts in order to fully understand its phenomenon. Under the carefully calligraphed heading, in the glow of the warm light contrasting with the surrounding cold, Alex began to create the list that was to become the manifesto of his engineering awakening. The first point he carved into the paper was 1. Thermal performance. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing his frozen mind to transport him to the interior of the traditional yurt, where warmth radiated like a living, pulsating heart of the steppe. He saw in macro close-up the fibrous, organic weave of the sheep's felt, the thick layer of compressed wool that acted as the ultimate natural insulator. He understood that felt was not merely a material, but a complex matrix of microscopic air pockets that in an ideal way retained the heat generated by the central hearth while simultaneously allowing the structure to breathe and neutralizing the problem of murderous condensation that had plagued his synthetic tent. This awareness was simultaneously as fascinating as it was humiliating.
Chapter 12. More than a shelter, a universe.
The transition from the absolute, unforgiving brutality of the Mongolian winter into the golden, enveloping sanctuary of the Gare was never merely a physical displacement for Alex. It was a profound ontological shift, a sudden movement between entirely different states of existence and modes of survival. Outside, the wide-angle reality of the vast, undulating steppe was an overwhelming, almost suffocating ocean of cold, characterized by a hyper-realistic, high-dynamic range of blinding, unblemished whites and deep, freezing cerulean blues, where the relentless wind whipped the crystalline structure of the snow into abrasive, blinding clouds that ruthlessly scoured the frozen land. But as Alex approached the heavy, felt-padded wooden door, his engineering mind began to deconstruct the genius of its placement, realizing that its orientation was far from arbitrary. It was, in fact, the very first line of code in the complex, ancient cultural software of this nomadic dwelling. The door always, without exception, faced south, a defiant yet deeply respectful orientation meticulously designed to turn its back on the savage freezing winds that howled down from the Siberian north, while simultaneously opening its arms to greet the life-giving ambient warmth of the southern sun. To step through this low, unassuming wooden frame, carefully lifting his heavy boots so as never to tread upon the sacred threshold, a deeply ingrained cultural taboo he had quickly learned to respect, was to leave behind the chaotic, meaningless void of the frozen wasteland and enter a meticulously ordered, mathematically precise universe. The moment the heavy wooden door thumped shut behind him, the cinematic, deafening roar of the exterior blizzard was instantly muffled into a low, distant, rhythmic hum, abruptly replaced by the intimate, shallow depth of field warmth and serenity of the interior space. Here, the air was intensely thick and heavy with the rich, comforting sense of burning willow wood, rendered animal fat, and the lanolin-rich aroma of old sheep's wool, a sensory landscape that stood in sharp, almost shocking contrast to the sterile, artificially filtered, ozone-tinged oxygen of his past life in the hyper-advanced technological world. The Gare was not just a shelter hastily thrown together to temporarily survive the elements. It was a highly deliberate, spiritually charged threshold, a piece of immaculate structural hardware that stood as a testament to thousands of years of iterative nomadic engineering and deep ecological harmony. Once inside, Alex's analytically trained eyes began to map the interior, slowly realizing that the circular footprint of the Gare was not a simple open room, but a rigorously divided canvas of deeply symbolic and highly functional zones, starting with the western half, universally designated as the man's domain. In the warm, flickering firelight, the incredibly rich textures of this space were brought into sharp, hyper-realistic relief, revealing a deeply masculine sphere defined by the tools of the hunt, the herd, and the vast open range.
Heavy, beautifully tooled leather riding saddles rested on wooden stands, the thick, aged hides worn smooth and polished to a deep, dark mahogany by years of friction against the heavy winter coats of the Mongolian horses. Coils of incredibly strong, braided horsehair rope hung from the wooden lattice, the fibrous, rough weave of the strands speaking of immense tensile strength and a deep, visceral connection to the animals that formed the lifeblood of the nomadic existence. Iron bits, bridles, and the dull, lethal gleam of a meticulously maintained hunting rifle caught the low-angle golden light of the central fire, casting long, stark, dramatic shadows across the curved, felt-lined walls of the dwelling. To Alex, every object in this western hemisphere of the Gare was a masterclass in functional, brutalist design, stripped of all unnecessary ornamentation and distilled down.
Chapter 13. A New Blueprint. The morning of departure arrived with a brutal, indifferent majesty, painting the vast Mongolian steppe in a cinematic display of hyper-realistic, terrifying beauty that completely overwhelmed the human senses. Outside the Jur, the dawn broke not with a gentle lightening of the sky, but with a violent clash of atmospheric titans, as the deep, bruised indigo and freezing sapphire hues of the receding night were suddenly violently pierced by the blinding, saturated cadmium orange and molten gold of the rising sun breaking over the jagged, unforgiving horizon. The camera of Alex's perception swept across the frozen landscape, capturing the immense, wide-angle scale of a world that cared absolutely nothing for human ambition or technological hubris. The high dynamic range of the environment was staggering. The deepest shadows held temperatures that could shatter synthetic polymers, while the direct sunlight brought a deceptive, blinding brilliance that offered no real warmth. The biting, relentless wind whipped across the plains, carrying suspended ice crystals and atmospheric diamond dust that caught the low-angle light, creating dancing, chaotic lens flares and a swirling, abrasive storm of particle effects that scoured the earth. The textures of this world were harsh and uncompromising. The crystalline, densely packed structure of the ancient snowpack that crunched like broken glass underfoot. The jagged, frost-wedged metamorphic rocks that ruptured the pristine white surface, and the solitary, perfectly geometry of the nomadic Jur standing as a singular, defiant node of life in an ocean of lethal cold. It was an environment of absolute, overwhelming scale, a primordial canvas that immediately rendered all of Alex's previous engineering triumphs infinitesimally small, insignificant, and fundamentally naive. Inside the dwelling, the atmosphere stood in absolute, life-saving contrast to the exterior hostility, filmed in the mind's eye with a shallow depth of field that brought the intimate, life-sustaining details into sharp emotional focus. The cold, piercing blue light of the dawn filtered tentatively down through the central circular opening of the tonneau, immediately meeting and being consumed by the rich, pulsing, ember-deep glow of the central cast-iron stove. The visual palette of the interior was dominated by incredibly warm, heavily saturated oranges, deep blood reds, and the ancient polished browns of smoke-stained wood, creating a sanctuary of thermodynamics that defied the murderous cold just inches away. Alex sat silently among his scattered gear, acutely hyper-aware of the jarring, almost offensive textural contrast between his possessions and the organic perfection of his surroundings. His equipment was a monument to synthetic arrogance. The cold, sterile, anodized aluminum cases, the dead, matte black nylon of his extreme weather sleeping bags, the high-tensile carbon fiber struts that felt alien and lifeless. These materials stood in stark, almost embarrassing opposition to the fibrous, chaotic, breathable weave of the sheep's wool felt that lined the walls, the naturally aged, deeply grained surface of the steam-bent willow roof poles, and the deeply weathered, crevice-lined skin of the nomadic family who still slept peacefully in the periphery of the golden light. Thick aromatic steam rose from a blackened kettle resting on the stove, the water molecules violently dancing in the heat, illuminated by the firelight in a slow-motion display of energy transfer that Alex now viewed not merely as physics, but as a profound localized miracle. The time for his highly funded, deeply publicized expedition to pack up and return to civilization had officially arrived, but as he sat in the warmth of the animal hide rugs, he realized with absolute certainty that the man preparing to leave was fundamentally, molecularly different from the arrogant architect who had arrived just weeks prior. With a heavy sigh that was
Chapter 14. The Farewell.
The morning of departure arrived with merciless, freezing precision, absolutely characteristic of the austere Mongolian steppe, where dawn is never a gentle phenomenon, but rather a violent, near-physical collision of the first sharp rays of light with the omnipresent, crystallized ice. Alex awoke slowly in the dense, textured semi-darkness of the yurt, feeling on his stiffened face a brisk, almost stinging breath of freezing air that had in some unfathomable way managed to force its way through the microscopic gaps in the thick, multi-layered panels of woolen felt covering the framework. He focused his sleep-heavy gaze on the intricate, organic weave of rough fibers directly above his head, which in the warm, pulsating, orange-red glow of the dying embers in the central hearth seemed almost to breathe in a synchronized rhythm with the powerful blows of the external wind. From the perspective of a shallow depth of field, simulating the almost macroscopic, analytical gaze of a camera, every single thread of raw, unprocessed sheep's wool appeared as a small, perfect, insulating miracle of engineering, deliberately designed to precisely trap microscopic air bubbles, protecting against the brutal outside temperature. The color palette inside this intimate asylum was absolutely dominated by rich, deep reds, burnt ochres, and dark browns of the old, wind-dried wooden construction, entering into a sharp, dramatic, and highly contrastive dialogue with the icy, penetrating cobalt blue of the Arctic morning, forcing itself through the ajar door. When Alex slowly and systematically began to pack his advanced, worth tens of thousands of dollars measuring equipment, he could not resist the overwhelming impression that all these modern laser sensors and complex thermal imaging cameras were nothing but clumsy, primitive tools in the face of the ancient wisdom encoded in the structure of the yurt. Packing kilometers of tangled cables and delicate sensors into foam-lined cases, his gaze traveled with respect across the curved, extraordinarily flexible wooden kana sticks, which, interwoven in a precise pattern, formed the load-bearing framework of the cylindrical wall. The entire complex structure resembled far more a living, stimulus-responsive biomechanical organism than a static building. He realized with a certainty that settled in him like the felt itself, warm, enveloping, and impossibly durable, that he was leaving with more than data. He was leaving with a completely transformed understanding of what architecture, engineering, and survival truly meant.
Chapter 15. The Solution That Cannot Be Improved.
The story draws to a close, tracing a majestic philosophical circle and returning to the grand, epic visual style reminiscent of the highest quality nature documentaries that opened this extraordinary multi-dimensional journey through time, boundless space, and the architectural genius of the nomads. On screen unfolds a stunning, hyper-realistic time-lapse montage revealing the Mongolian steppe in its full, pulsating summer bloom of a short yet extremely intense season, vibrant with an infinite palette of colors. The camera, equipped with lenses of powerful, almost microscopic resolution and an extremely high tonal dynamic range, records every, even the tiniest detail of this boundless, overwhelmingly vast landscape. The green, lush sea of tall grasses ripples under invisible, powerful air currents, resembling a gigantic living ocean in which countless points of wild, multicolored flowers serve as small, bright islands. At the very center of this organic, untamed chaos, like an absolute, incontrovertible mathematical certainty, stands the yurt, the ger. Its perfect circular geometry and immaculate white canvas strongly contrast with the wildness of the surrounding nature, while simultaneously, in an inexplicable, almost magical way, harmonizing completely with it, creating an inseparable whole. Sunlight falling at a sharp angle from a cloudless sky reveals the microscopic, complex textures of the felt's rough surface, single tangled fibers of sheep's wool that have compacted into a uniform, impenetrable protective shield. The camera, in a slow, hypnotic movement, circles this fascinating construction, recording with extraordinary precision how a deep shadow slowly moves across the gentle curve of the walls, further emphasizing the ideal, tradition-hallowed symmetry of the whole. Suddenly, in a fraction of a second, the image transitions into another phase of the time-lapse, transporting us from the green summer directly into the midst of a golden, melancholic autumn, where the Mongolian landscape takes on the colors of deep copper, burnt amber, and faded gold. The visual language focuses now on thermodynamic and structural phenomena, showing in slow motion how nomads reverently apply to their ger successive thick layers of heavy woolen felt, sealing every, even the tiniest gap against the penetrating cold. The camera analyzes the geometry of the roof, focusing on the compression ring called the tonneau, which, like the keystone in a classic arch, takes upon itself the entire enormous weight of the structure, evenly distributing it along the curved roof poles all the way down to the walls. This architectural masterpiece requires no nails, screws, or concrete foundations. It rests solely on the brilliant exploitation of the laws of physics, the balance between compressive and tensile forces, creating a structure so stable that it can survive the most merciless Mongolian Zud and serve its inhabitants for generations. The narrator delivers his final, deeply moving reflection that true genius does not shout, does not demand admiration, does not require a laboratory or a budget. It simply works. It has always worked, and it will always work. The ger, a solution that cannot be improved.